My name's Corey, and today we're making
this wall unit
with floating shelves
and LEDs
and wireless charger.
So this wall unit was made in 3 phases. The first phase was building the side shelves. The second was building the cabinet, and the third was building the 2 swing down doors. To start, I cut each shelf and the vertical riser from some 6/4 walnut to rough length and width. Then milled them flat using the jointer and thickness planer. The vertical riser had a large knot on one side, so I mixed up some slow hardening epoxy and filled all the voids. The next day, I removed the tape and used the card scraper to remove the bulk of the epoxy. Then sanded everything down with 120 grit sandpaper in the random orbit sander. To secure the shelves to the wall, I routed a groove on the back of each shelf about 5/8 of an inch wide and about 5/8 of an inch deep. When it came time to mount them, I screwed a piece of plywood to the wall that slid perfectly into the groove on the back of each shelf. Then I used some small brass screws to secure the shelf to the plywood from underneath. To attach each shelf to the vertical riser, I routed a groove equal to the width of each shelf so that they would slide perfectly into the groove. Before gluing it all up, I marked each shelf and applied a small 45-degree chamfer to all the edges. The next day, once the glue was dry, I sanded the entire shelf with 120 grit sandpaper and set it aside to start working on the cabinet body. For the cabinet body, I used 3/4 inch walnut veneered Baltic birch plywood. To cover the edges, I cut 1/4 inch wide strips of solid walnut on the table saw, passed them through the planer to smooth each side, then glued them to the edges of the plywood that would become the cabinet body. To hold down the walnut until the glue dried, I used regular painter's tape. The next day, once the glue was dry, I removed the tape, trimmed off the ends with a flush cut saw, and trimmed off the excess walnut on the router table using a flush trim bit. I repeated the same process for the ends of the top and bottom cabinet pieces, the interior shelves, and the vertical dividers. I sanded everything down with 120 grit sandpaper, then started on routing out the dados for the vertical dividers to sit in. I marked out where each vertical divider will sit, clamped a straight edge to my workpiece, and routed out a groove, making sure not to cut through the front face. Then, using a hammer and chisel, I squared up the corners of the dado and cut the vertical dividers to match, to sit flush with the front face once everything is glued up. With all the dados cut, I cut a few 2-inch holes to pass cables through each of the 3 units. On the underside of the top piece, I embedded a wireless phone charger. I first traced out the outline of the charger, then, over multiple passes, routed out the area until there would only be about 3/16 of an inch of wood left between the charger and the phone sitting above. Then, on the underside of the bottom piece, I routed a dado for the LED strip to sit in. With all my dados cut, it was time to glue up the main cabinet. I glued the vertical dividers in first, then laid the top piece on top and clamped everything together. While the cabinet dried, I started working on the swing down cabinet doors. I cut the rails and stiles to width on the table saw, then to length on the miter saw. After giving all the pieces a quick sanding, I used a slot cutting bit on my router to cut the tongue and groove for the rails and stiles, and a rabbet on the bottom side for the glass to sit in. With the rails and stiles cut and fitting together, I glued up both doors. Then let them sit overnight for the glue to dry. The next day, I gave them a quick sanding and started installing the hinges. I marked out the location of each hinge and used a Forstner bit to cut out a hole for each hinge. I marked, pre-drilled, and screwed the hinges to the door. Then marked the hole locations on the cabinet side. On one side of each door, I installed a gas shock to help keep the door in the closed position. The last step was drilling a few holes for the adjustable shelf pins. I made a template from some scrap plywood and drilled a few holes for each shelf. For the finish, I went with a few coats of walnut Danish oil. I applied it using a sponge brush, flooding the surface. After 10 minutes, I came back and wiped off the excess. This really brought out the grain of this beautiful walnut. After a few days for the finish to cure, I gave everything a quick hand sanding using 1000 grit sandpaper. Then applied some paste wax to the entire surface. To assemble the built-in wireless charger, I placed it in its groove, then added a few dabs of silicone caulking to keep it secure. I installed the cable pass-throughs also using a few dabs of silicone. To install the LED strip, I ripped off the adhesive backing and started sticking it in place. To hold it down more securely, I screwed a few plastic brackets around the corners to make sure it won't come off in the future. Then I reinstalled the doors and shocks using the holes I had previously drilled and inserted the glass from the back side of each door. To hold the glass in place, I used a thin bead of silicone caulking around the entire edge. Then smoothed it with my finger. For the drawer pulls, I went with something a bit different. I punched 2 holes into these leather straps that I made, then drilled 2 holes into each cabinet door, closer than the holes on the straps. Once installed with brass screws, the straps bulge out, giving you a nice leather handle to grab to open each door. Some protective pads for the cabinet doors, and this wall unit was done. Overall, I'm really happy with how this wall unit turned out. The LEDs and the built-in wireless charger really make it stand out. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for similar projects.